everybody. In keeping with our theme, I suppose that this talk could be called, "Who Do Men Say That I Am? A Bigot? Tolerance and Intolerance in the Christian Bible." Tolerance is an important value in modern culture. But are we as Christians supposed to be tolerant? And what exactly does it mean to be tolerant? Is it sometimes even wrong to be tolerant? Now, it turns out that the definition of tolerance has changed over time. A teacher of mine, D.A. Carson, that you can see on the screen there, wrote a book called The Intolerance of Tolerance, which I am drawing heavily on. If you're interested in the topic, I would recommend his book to you. But he points out how the concept of tolerance has changed in recent years. The old definition of tolerance you might call the modernist definition. According to the modernist definition, that while you disagreed with someone, you might tolerate them. And indeed, if you tolerated them, you would say that you believe that everyone should be free to express what they think, even if you find their views ignorant or stupid. This kind of understanding of tolerance was once placed on the editorial pages of newspapers, where a quote attributed to the French philosopher Voltaire, although he probably didn't say it, states, "I may detest what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Undergirding this is the belief that there really was such a thing as truth, and that free discourse and debate was an important aspect of finding and exploring it. Truth was desirable and attainable. But the new definition of tolerance, we might call that the postmodern definition of tolerance, starts with the basic premise that at least in matters of morality and belief, there is no truth, only opinions. Tolerance in this new sense means that one can never say anything that criticizes or offends another person's beliefs. All views must be tolerated. Now, the second definition of tolerance suffers from logical fallacies. First of all, unless you firmly disagree with someone's opinion, you can't really be said to be tolerant of it. If I disagree, say, with Marxism, it would be an act of tolerance for me to insist that, Marxist professors should be allowed to express their views by teaching in the universities, even though I find their views disagreeable. That would be tolerance under the old definition. But if you are unwilling to say whether either Marxism or capitalism is wrong or one is better than the other, then you're not being tolerant. There's no occasions for tolerance if you don't care or don't have an opinion. The postmodern conception of tolerance confuses tolerance with indifference towards truth. Secondly, and more importantly, those holding to this definition of tolerance will go ballistic when someone expresses strong disagreements with someone's belief or viewpoint, condemning that person as being intolerant. However, their condemnation of intolerance is, in fact, an expression of intolerance. And indeed, in order to reinforce their postmodern view of tolerance, they'll get governments and other institutions to enforce their definition of tolerance in a way that tries to crush those who disagree with it. And hence, as D.A. Carson puts it, we get the intolerance of tolerance. And at the present time, we're getting a lot of that. And a fair amount of it is directed towards Christians. For example, in September of last year, the University of California retracted its recognition of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship as a student organization because it required its officers to be Christians. Not the members, not the people that came, but the officers had to be Christians of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Well, they found that intolerant, and so they banned them. Or also in September of last year, New England Association of Schools and Colleges threatened to withdraw the accreditation of Gordon College, an evangelical Christian college, kind of like us, in Massachusetts, because Gordon College forbids its students from engaging in sex outside of heterosexual marriage. The accrediting agency considered this discriminatory against homosexuals, and so in the name of tolerance, it's showing intolerance towards Gordon College. Or to give you an international example, the Council of Dudley in Worcester, in England, banned all images or representations of pigs from its benefit departments on the grounds that Muslims coming in for benefits might be offended. Calendars with pigs, porcelain figurines in the shape of pigs, even pig-shaped stress relievers, those spongy things you squeeze in order to relieve stress in your hands. All this had to go, including a tissue box depicting Winnie the Pooh and his friend Piglet. All this was part of the country which traditionally has raised a lot of pigs. And when pressed as to why pigs had to go, the counselor, who is Bubur Rahman, who himself was a Muslim, explained, well, it's necessary, it's a tolerance of people's beliefs, because, Muslims might be offended. But this is stunning doublespeak, is it not? What about tolerance towards those people who think differently about pigs? So we have this new definition. I like the older definition better. Well, what about the Bible? And what about, actually, before I get to the Bible, what about certain situations where maybe tolerance is intolerable? I think I have a case of that from when the British controlled India. They outlawed a practice called sati, and that is widow burning. See, when the husband died, many widows were forced against their will to be burned to death on their funeral pyre of their husband. And that was local custom of certain Hindus. And when the British ran into this, they put an end to the practice based on their Christian moral principles. They were accused then of being intolerant of Hindu culture. And when local Hindu priests complained to the British governor, a man by the name of Charles Napier, about the prohibition of sati by the British authorities, Napier replied, according to his brother, well, be it so. This burning of widows is your custom. Prepare the funeral pyre. But my nation has a custom also. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate all their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect giblets on which to hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. Let us all act according to national customs. Now, I would submit to you that Napier was right to stop the burning of widows, even though it was religious custom. There are some things, even sanctioned by a religion, that cannot be tolerated. So now I get to the question of, well, what does the Bible say about tolerance and intolerance? And my thesis is going to be this, that the Bible in some ways is tolerant, and in some ways is not. First of all, the basis for tolerance comes from the Old Testament, from the concept of the image of God in humanity. A distinctive teaching about human beings that the Bible gives us is that we are made in the image of God. You can read about that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God made mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Now, what exactly does it mean to be made in the image of God? Mark Twain got it a little wrong. He seemed to think it meant that we look like God. This is what he says, I was made merely in the image of God, but not otherwise resembling him enough to be mistaken for him, except by a very nearsighted person. I don't think it has much to do with that. It's not that we look like God physically. God is actually invisible and incorporeal, actually, in his essence. But rather, it means that human beings have certain mental and spiritual qualities that make us like God. For example, we have reason, we have intelligence, we have personality, emotions, free will, self-consciousness, intelligence, creativity, the ability to make moral choices, the ability to relate to God with a spiritual nature. Speech is sometimes mentioned. There's various ways in which we have these abilities, unlike animals, or to a much higher degree than the animals, and that's probably the sense of what it means to be made in the image of God. Now, I submit to you that this is a fundamental basis for toleration of other human beings. There's something great about every human being. No matter how cruelly people may behave, no matter how wrong-headed their thinking may be philosophically or religiously, according to the Bible, all people are made in God's image. And we should respect the dignity of all human beings because they have a reflection of something about what God is like, regardless of their religion or any other sociological class you want to stick them in. Respecting the dignity of others is a key element to tolerance. Now, this viewpoint can be contrasted with the irreligious view of naturalism. Naturalism is a philosophical view that says nature is all there is, and therefore there is no God. And so, naturally, it denies the concept of the image of God in mankind. But because it does that, it really lacks any basis for affirming the dignity of all human beings. Indeed, Steven Pinker, who's a professor of psychology at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he commented on this. He wrote an article some years ago called "The Stupidity of Dignity," where he, who is an atheist, thinks that society's belief in the dignity of all human beings, which of course is a vestige of our Christian heritage, is foolish. The Bible, in contrast, affirms human dignity by affirming that all human beings are made in the image of God. And I wonder, as our society becomes more secular, how long will belief in the inherent dignity of all human beings going to last if that trend continues? So the Bible's teaching concerning the image of God in mankind is the basis for tolerance. But now let me move on to, well, what about the Old Testament laws? What do they have to say about this subject matter? And there's a law that's kind of interesting because it has both intolerance and tolerance in side-by-side verses. The first verse is verse 21 of Exodus 22, or verse 20 of Exodus 22, where it says, "You must not, whoever sacrifices to any god except the Lord alone is to be set apart for destruction." Now that doesn't sound very tolerant. And in this regard, the Hebrew Bible is clearly a lot less tolerant than paganism, polytheism that was in the surrounding cultures. A polytheist can say, well, you have your gods and I have my gods, And moreover, if your God is similar to one of my gods, maybe we can equate them. For example, the Romans worship the goddess Diana, the Anatolians worship the goddess Artemis, and they could just say, well, we'll just say they're the same goddess. Even though it doesn't quite mesh together, we'll just call them the same, and then worship them under the same label. Hebrew Bible is not tolerant in that regard. No other gods before me versus the Ten Commandments is not a statement of tolerance. But before you conclude that the Old Testament is intolerant in its entirety, look at the very next verse. You must not exploit a foreign resident or oppress him, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Now, a foreign resident, traditionally translated as sojourner, was a non-Israelite, non-Canaanite foreigner living in the land. And what's really interesting here is that you would expect that kind of person, that foreigner, to be a worshiper of other gods. I mean, everybody did except Israel. Nobody was monotheistic except Israel in those days. And so by placing immediately after the condemnation of sacrifice to other gods, a statement affirming that we should not exploit but should rather treat decently the sojourner is kind of a stark contrast. And this goes along with other laws against exploiting vulnerable classes like widows and orphans and debtors and the like. And it's a remarkable law. Well, you're not to have idolatry, but you're to treat the idolaters decently. And this represents an enlightened attitude towards non-Israelites. And there's no parallel in Mesopotamian laws. Indeed, according to rabbinic counting, the Torah, the law of the Old Testament, cautions Israel concerning the behavior towards a foreigner some 36 times. That's more times than it tells the Old Testament Israelites to love God. That's more commandments than it tells them to keep the Sabbath, or to keep circumcision, or to avoid falsehood, or avoid committing theft. A lot of words about treating these people decently, even though they worship other gods. This command to treat sojourners decently is an act of toleration. And I would submit to you that we should be tolerant, at least in that sense, to the foreign immigrants that come to Rochester, some of whom are Muslim, a lot of them from Somalia in this particular community, that we should treat them decently, even if we radically disagree with their religion. Now, you might contrast that with how the group ISIS in Syria is behaving. They have told at least some people, convert to Islam or die. Israel was told in contrast, be kind to foreign infidels. Well, let's move on to the New Testament. And now I want to look at the Apostle Paul in this regard. Does he say anything that might relate to the idea of tolerance and intolerance? And I think in Acts chapter 17 he does. This is where Paul was in Athens in Greece, and he was speaking to a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in an attempt to convert them to the Christian faith. But anyway, in Acts 17 and verse 22, he says the following. He says, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, it is the Lord of heaven and earth, who does not live in temples built by hands. He himself gives life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their land. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our beings, as some of your poets have said. We are his offspring. Now, I submit that this passage is a case of both intolerance and tolerance on the case of Paul. Paul clearly is trying to get people to change their religion, to give up their idolatry and to accept the God of the Bible as their God. But along the way, there are at least some elements of tolerance in his address to the Greek philosophers. It's seen in particular in the way that he uses the words of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. You see, he quotes one of each. In verse 28, when it says, "For in him we move and have our being," that's actually a direct quotation from a Cretan philosopher, Epimenides. And in verse 28, we are his offspring, is a direct quotation from the Stoic philosopher Aratus. In other words, Paul is acknowledging, well, even your philosophers have gotten some things right. And he commends them for having an altar to an unknown God, because in that they are humbly conceding that, well, they don't know everything that there is about the divine, and they have that right too. Paul acknowledges that there are good and wise and true sayings said by non-Christian writers. The Bible doesn't say that everything is totally wrong in either paganism or any other religion. Even idol worshippers have gotten some important things right. You see, all truth is God's truth, even if somebody from a non-biblical religion thought of it. That there is wisdom in non-biblical religion can and should be freely acknowledged, even if, from the Bible's point of view, non-biblical religions are also substantially wrong, especially about theology. Now, another place in Paul, he shows a bit less tolerance, though a bit of tolerance too. And that's a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 through 13. There he writes this, writing to the church at Corinth, he says, "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people," not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral or greedy or swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you'd have to leave this world. But I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, or is an idolater or a slanderer or a drunkard or a swindler. Do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside, but expel the wicked person from among you." Now here, Paul is advising the church at Corinth to be intolerant of fellow professing Christians who do not live up to their Christian profession in the area of ethics. They were to shun and not associate with such people, but he gives a rather different advice concerning non-Christians. No one can expect non-Christians to live up to the standards of Christian ethics. Those outside the church are not to be judged the way that the church is to judge their own, who fail to live up to the ethical standards that they profess to affirm. So this is an example of intolerance towards Christians, but tolerance towards non-Christians. And now I move to Jesus. What was Jesus' attitude towards, say, those of other religions? Well, again, there are elements of both tolerance and intolerance. On the one hand, in terms of tolerance, Jesus was known to pray for the forgiveness of the Roman pagans who crucified him. Father, forgive. That's what somebody, actually a little girl, a Christian girl in Syria was asked, what would you do to the ISIS people if you had them? And she said, well, I pray that God forgive them, echoing Jesus' words. He prayed for those who crucified them. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. He demanded the Roman centurion. He made a Samaritan, and Samaritans kind of believed like the Jews, but they were considered unorthodox, heterodox, heretical. He made a Samaritan, and not the Jewish priests or Levites, the hero of his story, the Good Samaritan. He came to be a light of revelation for the Gentiles, Luke 2:32 says. And although during his lifetime his message was for Israel, his departing words to his disciples was to make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them and teaching them all that Jesus had taught them. But on the other hand, there's intolerance there too. Jesus describes himself as presiding over the last judgment of the nations, in which he would determine their eternal destiny, depending on how they related to him. You read about that in Matthew 25. He even insists that he is the only way to God. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Seems to imply that only through Jesus can a person truly find God. And yet, on the area of tolerance, Jesus' teaching provides a basis for legal toleration of non-Christian religions. And the place where he does that is a verse in Matthew 22:21, where he says, render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's. And kind of a similar saying elsewhere in John's Gospel, my kingdom is not of this world. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar. Render unto God that which is God. Now, according to Paul, even though the state has been ordained by God to create order in society by punishing wrongdoers, you read about that in Romans 13, our obligation to the state is not religious. Our religious allegiance is solely to God. And this goes back to that statement by Christ, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's. Now, Jesus' teaching has been, as people meditated on it and applied it, has developed into a concept of the separation of church and state. A concept which is a great advancement in political thought. And when applied consistently, it means that the state should not be involved in the establishment of a specific religion. By the way, this concept of separation of church and state is one that is completely alien to traditional Islam. In fact, it explicitly rejects it. Islam, historically speaking at least, has sought to make the state an agent of Islam and to use the power of the state to pressure non-Muslims to convert to Islam, forcing them to pay a special tax from which Muslims are exempt, or to impose various other indignities on non-Muslims. And furthermore, it punishes, even executes Muslims who dare to convert to another religion. In Islam, converting to Christianity is a capital offense. Islam means submission. Those who fail to submit to the Islamic State are subject to being killed. In contrast, the Christian concept of the separation of church and state that derives itself from Jesus' statement about rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar, Caesar's and rendering unto God that which is God, that forms a conceptual framework that in principle can allow legal toleration and equal standing under the law for all other religions. Indeed, I would argue that the Christian gospel itself is a basis for toleration. Now, you undoubtedly know the most famous verse in the Bible, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Now, part of the statement of that verse is that in order to become a Christian, you have to believe. You have to choose to receive Christ and believe in him. For a non-Christian to become a Christian, that person has to cooperate in the process. No one can force a person to have faith. You can force a person, say, to be baptized. You can force a person to submit to certain rules, but you can't force them to believe. And it was kind of an unfortunate thing when Constantine of Rome converted to Christianity. He pressured people to become Christians too. He baptized his armies, and they ended up being an army of baptized pagans. I mean, they were baptized, but they didn't have true faith. You can force people to be baptized. You can't force them to become Christians. That has to be freely accepted. Now, this unfortunate alliance of church and state that was common in the Middle Ages began to come apart, especially with the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther became convinced, and I believe rightly, that the Roman Catholic Church had some serious misunderstandings about the nature of the Christian gospel. Paul reasserted Paul's teaching that salvation was by faith alone, that good works do not somehow merit salvation for a person. And he was told to recant by the Pope. But when he was told this, Luther said this. He said, unless I am convinced by the evidence of Scripture or by plain reason, for I do not accept the authority of the Pope or the councils alone, since it is established that they have erred and contradicted themselves, I am bound by the Scriptures I have cited, and by my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. God help me. Amen. Now, Luther's case provided, for at least Protestant Christianity, a precedence for allowing freedom of conscience in matters of religion. A freedom of conscience that really goes back to the nature of the gospel itself, that must be freely accepted by each individual so that no one can be forced to be a Christian. It is the Christian gospel itself that gives a basis for freedom of conscience. Again, to become a Christian, one must freely believe, but that implies freedom not to believe as well. And we must tolerate people that choose not to believe. So let me bring this to a conclusion. The Bible is a mixture of tolerance and intolerance. Biblical Christians should gladly tolerate other religions in the sense that we can affirm that other religions have and should have as much legal right to exist as Christianity does. It can affirm that there are important truths in other religions. But the Christian Bible does not affirm that all religions are equally valid. The Bible affirms that biblical Christianity is the true religion. So is the Christian Bible tolerant or intolerant? It is both. It calls on all people everywhere to repent and to believe in Jesus Christ and be saved. But it's the nature of that Christian message to allow people the freedom to accept or reject that gospel. And allowing that freedom demands considerable